"We don't host people like you here. Get out before I call security to kick you out." The words cut through the marble lobby like a knife, echoing off crystal chandeliers as the blonde receptionist sneered. The black woman stood frozen at the front desk of a luxury hotel, while security moved in to physically remove her. But here's what none of them knew. The woman they were humiliating, calling a criminal, and trying to throw out owned the entire hotel chain. And one phone call later, every single person who participated in this racist attack was fired on the spot. Before we start this story, if you stand against prejudice and support justice, click the subscribe button, type justice, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. It was 9:30 p.m. on a cold Tuesday evening at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel in downtown Chicago. The marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, reflecting the warm golden light that bathed the opulent lobby. The automatic glass doors slid open with a whisper, and in walked Lauren Matthews. At 37 years old, Lauren carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had fought for every success in her life. Her intelligent brown eyes scanned the lobby with the practiced gaze of someone who noticed details others missed. Her natural hair was pulled back into a neat, professional bun, though a few strands had escaped during her travels, framing her face in a way that softened her determined expression. Lauren's navy blue business suit, while clearly expensive and well-tailored, showed the telltale signs of a long day of travel. The fabric was slightly wrinkled from hours of sitting in airports and airplanes. Her matching heels clicked softly against the marble as she pulled a modest black rolling suitcase behind her. It wasn't the Louis Vuitton luggage typically seen in this establishment, but it was practical and efficient, much like Lauren herself. Despite her obvious fatigue, there was something unmistakably dignified about the way Lauren moved. Her shoulders were straight, her head held high, carrying the invisible weight of decades of having to prove herself in rooms where she was often the only person who looked like her. She approached the front desk with the measured steps of someone accustomed to being judged before speaking a single word. Behind the imposing mahogany front desk stood Sarah Mitchell, 32 years old and the picture of conventional beauty standards. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect waves that probably took an hour to achieve, not a strand out of place despite being near the end of her shift. Her manicured nails were painted a pristine nude color, and her makeup was flawless, the kind of appearance that required constant maintenance and spoke to someone who took pride in looking the part of luxury hospitality. But as Lauren approached, something ugly flickered across Sarah's perfectly made-up features. Her blue eyes narrowed as they took in Lauren from head to toe, lingering on her natural hair, her slightly wrinkled suit, her modest suitcase. Sarah's glossy lips curled into what might have passed for a polite smile to a casual observer, but anyone paying attention would have noticed it didn't reach her eyes. There was a coldness there, a judgment that had nothing to do with Lauren's ability to pay and everything to do with the color of her skin. "Good evening," Lauren said, her voice warm but professional, tinged with the exhaustion of someone who had been traveling all day. "I'd like to book a room for tonight, please." The request was simple, straightforward, the kind heard hundreds of times each day at hotel front desks across the country. But Sarah's response revealed the ugly reality that still existed in America. Sarah looked Lauren up and down with undisguised disgust, as if she was examining something unpleasant she had found on the bottom of her shoe. "I'm sorry," she said, though there wasn't a trace of actual apology in her tone. "We don't have any rooms available." But the Grand Metropolitan's lobby was practically empty. A quick glance around revealed only a handful of guests scattered across the vast space. An elderly couple sat by the fireplace, sharing quiet conversation over evening tea. A businessman in an expensive suit tapped away on his laptop near the windows. The atmosphere was peaceful, serene even, the kind of quiet that only came when a hotel was far from capacity. Lauren noticed this immediately. Her intelligent eyes swept the lobby, taking in the obvious lack of crowds, the abundant seating, the relaxed pace of the few staff members visible. She turned back to Sarah with a slight frown creasing her brow. "Are you sure?" Lauren asked, her voice still polite but with a note of confusion that any reasonable person would have felt in this situation. "It seems pretty quiet tonight." And here's where the mask completely slipped. Sarah's fake professional demeanor crumbled, replaced by something so ugly, so blatantly racist that it took your breath away. "Ma'am," Sarah said, her voice dripping with condescension and contempt, "this is a 5-star establishment. We don't host people like you here. You obviously can't even afford it. You should try the shelter downtown." The phrase hung in the air like a poisonous cloud, revealing exactly what Sarah thought about Lauren based solely on the color of her skin. The irony was devastating. Lauren Matthews, the woman being told she belonged in a homeless shelter, actually owned the very hotel where she was being denied service. But Sarah Mitchell didn't know this. As far as Sarah was concerned, she was looking at just another black woman who had somehow wandered into their space. And Sarah was about to reveal just how deep her prejudices ran. Standing behind Sarah, giggling like schoolgirls sharing a cruel joke, was Amy Chen, the 24-year-old assistant front desk clerk. Amy was new to the hospitality industry, still learning the ropes, but she had apparently learned all the wrong lessons from her colleagues. Amy leaned over to Sarah and whispered something that made both women suppress laughter. It was the kind of behavior you might have expected from middle school bullies, not from professional adults working in customer service. But there they were, treating Lauren's presence like it was some kind of joke they were both in on. Approaching from the side was Jessica Torres, the 27-year-old night manager. Jessica had been with the hotel for 3 years and had worked her way up from front desk clerk to her current position. Jessica's dark eyes rolled dramatically as she overheard Lauren's request for a room. There was no attempt to hide her disdain, no effort to maintain even a facade of professional courtesy. She approached the front desk with the swagger of someone who thought she was about to handle a problem. This was the scene Lauren found herself in, surrounded by hotel employees who had already judged her guilty of the crime of being black in their space. But Lauren didn't know what they were thinking yet. She was still operating under the assumption that she was dealing with professional hospitality workers who would treat her with basic courtesy. "Do you need my credit card or identification?" Lauren asked, reaching into her purse to retrieve her corporate American Express card and her driver's license. The credit card was black, the kind reserved for customers with exceptional credit and significant spending power. Her ID showed an address in Lincoln Park, one of Chicago's most affluent neighborhoods. But none of this mattered to Sarah Mitchell. She didn't even glance at the credit card or ID. Instead, she responded with words that should have ended her career on the spot. "The card is probably stolen or fake anyway," Sarah said with a smirk. "We don't want trouble here." The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Sarah had just accused Lauren of being a criminal based on nothing more than the color of her skin. There was no evidence, no reason for suspicion, just pure, unadulterated racism. Amy Chen found this hilarious. She snickered audibly and added her own contribution to the humiliation. "She probably can't even afford our parking rates." Lauren's composure in this moment was remarkable. Lesser people might have lost their temper, might have started shouting or demanding to speak to a manager. But Lauren Matthews had faced discrimination before. She knew that losing her cool would only give these people ammunition to use against her. So she took a deep breath and maintained her dignity. "Is there a problem with my credit card or identification?" she repeated, her voice still calm, but with an edge of steel that suggested she wasn't going to be easily dismissed. This was when Jessica Torres decided to join the party. The night manager approached with the kind of confident stride that came from someone who thought they had all the power in this situation. "The problem," Jessica said, her voice dripping with condescension, "is you don't belong here. This isn't that kind of neighborhood. I'm a paying customer requesting a room, Lauren said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. What's the issue? And this was when Marcus Johnson, the security, decided it was time to make his presence known. The security guard took a step closer to Lauren, using his considerable size to try to intimidate her. His movement was deliberate, calculated to make Lauren feel threatened and unwelcome. "Lady," Marcus said, his voice low and menacing, "you heard them. Time to move along." The threat was unmistakable. 4 hotel employees had now ganged up on one woman whose only crime was asking for a room while being black. They had accused her of theft, insulted her financial status, told her she didn't belong in their neighborhood, and now they were physically intimidating her. Lauren Matthews took a deep breath, gathering the composure that had carried her through decades of facing discrimination in boardrooms, business meetings, and moments just like this one. She looked directly at Jessica Torres, the night manager, who had just told her she didn't belong in this kind of neighborhood. "I'd like to speak with the manager, please," Lauren said, her voice steady and professional, despite the humiliation she was enduring. And here's where Jessica Torres revealed the full extent of her arrogance and prejudice. Instead of showing even basic professional courtesy, instead of recognizing that any reasonable customer would want to escalate this situation, Jessica puffed up with the kind of authority that came from someone drunk on their own small amount of power. "I am the manager," Jessica snapped, her voice rising with indignation, "and I'm telling you to leave." The emphasis on AM was deliberate, designed to put Lauren in her place, to make her understand that Jessica considered herself the ultimate authority in this situation. It was the voice of someone who had never been challenged, never been held accountable for treating customers with basic human dignity. "I'd like to speak with the general manager then," Lauren responded calmly, demonstrating the kind of persistence that any reasonable business would have appreciated in a customer seeking resolution to a problem. This was when Sarah Mitchell decided to show just how deep her racism ran. The blonde receptionist, who had started this entire confrontation with her "you people" comment, leaned forward with a smirk that would have made you want to reach through the screen and shake some sense into her. "Mr. Richardson doesn't waste time with people like you," Sarah said, the contempt dripping from every word. There it was again. People like you. Not dissatisfied customers, not potential guests with concerns. People like you. Sarah was making it crystal clear that in her mind, Lauren's race disqualified her from deserving the time and attention of the general manager. And Amy Chen, not to be outdone in the cruelty department, added her own contribution to this festival of racism. "Yeah, he's got real guests to worry about." Real guests. As if Lauren's money wasn't real. As if her request for service wasn't legitimate. As if her very presence somehow diminished the hotel's atmosphere. Amy's comment revealed a worldview where black customers weren't considered real customers, where their business wasn't valued or wanted. Lauren drew herself up to her full height, channeling the dignity her grandmother had taught her, and made one more attempt at basic customer service. "I simply want to book a room," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "I have valid payment and ID." And here's where Jessica Torres revealed just how deep her ignorance ran. Instead of recognizing that she was dealing with an intelligent, articulate customer making a reasonable request, Jessica responded with the kind of condescension typically reserved for people she considered intellectually inferior. "And I'm telling you, we're full," Jessica said, speaking slowly and deliberately as if Lauren might not understand. "Can't you understand English?" Marcus Johnson, the security guard who had been lurking nearby like a predator waiting for his moment, decided this was his cue to escalate the intimidation. "Want me to escort her out now?" he asked Jessica, cracking his knuckles again in a deliberate show of physical threat. But just when you thought this situation couldn't get any worse, just when you thought these employees had revealed the full extent of their prejudice, The general manager himself decided to make an appearance. Robert Richardson emerged from his office like a king surveying his domain. At 55 years old, Richardson had the bearing of a man who had never been challenged, never been held accountable for his actions. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair impeccably styled, his entire appearance designed to project authority and superiority. But the moment Richardson's eyes landed on Lauren, his expression shifted to one of immediate hostility. He didn't see a potential customer. He didn't see a businesswoman seeking accommodation. He saw a black woman in his lobby, and that was all the information he needed to form his opinion. "What's this commotion about?" Richardson demanded, his voice carrying the irritation of someone whose valuable time was being wasted on trivial matters. Sarah Mitchell, eager to curry favor with her boss, jumped in with her version of events. "This woman won't leave," she reported, as if Lauren was some kind of trespasser rather than a customer seeking service. "She's demanding a room." Sarah was framing Lauren as unreasonable and aggressive, setting Richardson up to see her as a problem to be solved rather than a customer to be served. And Richardson, showing that the rot in this hotel went all the way to the top, didn't disappoint. He looked Lauren up and down with the kind of obvious disdain that would have been shocking in any professional setting, sizing her up like she was something unpleasant he had found on his shoe. "Ma'am," Richardson said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I think you're lost. The bus station is 6 blocks that way." The implication was clear and devastating. Richardson assumed that Lauren had arrived by bus, that she didn't have the means for any other form of transportation, that she had somehow wandered into his luxury hotel by mistake. It was classism and racism rolled into one ugly package, delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that suggested this wasn't Richardson's first time making such comments. Lauren, maintaining the composure that had served her well in countless business negotiations, responded with professional clarity. "Sir, I'm requesting to book a room at your hotel." Simple. Direct. Reasonable. The kind of statement that should have been met with, "Certainly, let me check our availability," or "I'd be happy to help you with that." Instead, Richardson delivered a response that made you want to throw something at your screen. "Our rooms start at $400 per night," Richardson said with a smug smile. "That's probably more than you make in a month." The assumption here was staggering. Richardson had looked at Lauren, a professional woman carrying legitimate identification and corporate credit cards, and decided that she couldn't possibly afford a hotel room that cost $400 per night. He had made this judgment based entirely on her race, without knowing anything about her income, her profession, or her financial status. But Richardson wasn't done. While he was delivering this financial insult, Sarah and Amy were having their own little racist conference at the front desk. They leaned together, whispering and giggling like teenagers sharing cruel gossip. Their behavior was so unprofessional, so obviously inappropriate, that it would have been grounds for immediate termination at any decent establishment. And then Jessica Torres, not to be outdone in the racism competition, added her own theory about Lauren's presence. "She's probably here to case the place," Jessica whispered, just loud enough for Lauren to hear. Case the place. As in, Lauren was conducting surveillance for a future robbery. Jessica had looked at a well-dressed professional woman asking to book a room and decided she must be a criminal. There was no evidence for this assumption, no reasonable basis for suspicion, just the racist belief that black people in upscale spaces must be up to no good. Richardson, apparently feeling that his employees weren't being quite racist enough, decided to escalate the situation to its inevitable conclusion. "Marcus," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Remove this woman immediately. She's disturbing our atmosphere." Lauren hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made any threats. She hadn't been anything but polite and professional. But her mere presence, her audacity to request service while being black, was apparently disturbing to the hotel's atmosphere. This was the moment when the full weight of institutional racism became clear. It wasn't just one bigoted employee, it was the entire system, from the front desk to the general manager, working together to exclude based on nothing but the color of her skin. Marcus Johnson, who had been waiting for this moment, approached Lauren with the kind of aggressive body language designed to intimidate and threaten. "Come on, let's go," Marcus said, his voice low and menacing. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." If you were in Lauren's shoes, what would you have done? Would you leave the hotel to maintain peace, or reveal who you are and fire the entire management? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to click the subscribe button now as we continue the story. "I'm not leaving," Lauren said, her voice steady and determined, "until someone explains why I can't book a room with available credit and valid ID." It was a perfectly reasonable demand. Lauren was asking for basic customer service, for someone to explain why a paying customer with proper identification was being refused service. In any legitimate business, this would have prompted a review of policies and procedures. Instead, Richardson decided to reveal the full extent of his bigotry. "Because we reserve the right to refuse service to anyone," Richardson declared, puffing up with the kind of authority that came from someone who had never been challenged, "and we don't want your kind here." There it was. The mask was completely off now. Your kind. Not difficult customers, not people without proper identification or payment. Your kind. Richardson had made it crystal clear that this hotel practiced racial discrimination, that black customers were not welcome regardless of their ability to pay or their conduct. But here's where the story took a turn. Because Lauren Matthews, standing there facing this wall of racism and hostility, calmly reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "I'm going to make a call," she announced, her voice carrying a quiet confidence that should have been a warning to everyone in that lobby. Sarah Mitchell, drunk on her own perceived power, responded with the kind of arrogance that was about to cost her everything. "Call whoever you want." Sarah sneered. "Nobody's going to help you." If Sarah had only known what was about to happen, she would have gotten on her knees and begged Lauren's forgiveness. But Sarah was operating under the assumption that Lauren was powerless, that she had no recourse, that there would be no consequences for this discrimination. Lauren dialed a number, and when the call connected, she spoke just one sentence that changed everything. "David, assemble the board for a meeting at Grand Metropolitan Hotel in 1 hour." Richardson overheard fragments of the conversation, and for the first time there was a flicker of uncertainty in his arrogant demeanor. "Board meeting?" he scoffed, but there was something in his voice that suggested he wasn't as confident as he had been moments before. "Lady, what kind of games are you playing?" Lauren ended her call and looked directly at Richardson with the kind of calm confidence that came from holding all the cards in a poker game. "I'll be back in exactly 1 hour, she said, her voice carrying an authority that none of them recognized yet. "Have your head manager contact the branch manager immediately." The specificity of her instructions should have been another warning sign. Lauren wasn't making vague threats or empty promises. She was giving specific directives with the precision of someone who knew exactly how corporate hierarchies worked. But Richardson, blinded by his own prejudice and arrogance, responded with the kind of dismissive comment that he was going to regret for the rest of his life. "You're delusional if you think anyone cares about your complaints," he scoffed. Because Lauren Matthews wasn't just any customer. She wasn't just a successful businesswoman who could afford their most expensive suite. She was the CEO and majority owner of Sterling Matthews Hospitality Group, the company that owned the Grand Metropolitan Hotel and paid Richardson's salary. In exactly 1 hour, Richardson and his racist employees were going to learn what happened when you discriminated against your own boss. And trust me, what happened next was going to be the most satisfying display of justice you had ever witnessed. Lauren walked out of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel with the same dignity she had entered with, but now there was something different in her step. something that should have terrified every single person who had just humiliated her. She moved through the lobby like someone who knew exactly what was about to happen, like someone who held all the power in a situation where everyone else thought they had won. The automatic doors closed behind her with a soft whoosh, and Lauren found herself in the hotel's parking lot, standing under the glow of expensive landscape lighting. The Chicago skyline stretched out before her, a testament to the kind of ambition and determination that had built her empire. But right then, Lauren wasn't thinking about the beauty of the city she had helped shape. She was thinking about justice. Lauren reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Not just any phone, but the kind of device that held the contact information of some of the most powerful people in American business. Her hands were trembling slightly, but not from fear. This was the trembling that came from controlled fury, from righteous anger that was about to be channeled into swift and decisive action. The first call she made set everything in motion. "David," Lauren said when the call connected, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Pull all management files for Grand Metropolitan immediately." David Sterling, the chairman of Sterling Matthews Hospitality Group's board of directors, didn't question the urgency in Lauren's voice. He had worked with her long enough to know that when Lauren Matthews called with specific instructions, something serious was happening. "I want performance reviews, hiring records, customer complaints, everything," Lauren continued. "And David? Start with Robert Richardson, Sarah Mitchell, Jessica Torres, Amy Chen, and Marcus Johnson. I want to know every detail about how they've been treating our guests." But Lauren wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Her second call was to the legal department, and this was where things started to get really interesting. "Legal? This is Lauren," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who signed the paychecks of some of the best attorneys in Chicago. "I need discrimination documentation started immediately. Yes, you heard me correctly, against our own property. I was just denied service at the Grand Metropolitan based on my race," Lauren explained to her legal team. "I have witnesses, I want security footage pulled, and I want a complete civil rights violation report on my desk by morning. These people just committed federal crimes, and I want it documented properly." The third call was the one that was going to change everything. This was the call that was going to bring Lauren's full power to bear on the situation. "Board members," Lauren said, her voice now carrying the tone of a CEO who was done playing games. "Emergency meeting in 45 minutes. We have a serious civil rights violation at one of our properties, and heads are going to roll tonight." Emergency board meetings didn't happen often in the corporate world. They were reserved for crises, for situations so serious that they required immediate attention from the highest levels of leadership. The fact that Lauren was calling one meant that what had happened at the Grand Metropolitan wasn't just a customer service failure. It was a company-threatening crisis that required swift action. "I need everyone there," Lauren continued. "William Hayes, all department heads. And I want our diversity and inclusion team on standby. We're about to have a very public reckoning with institutional racism, and I want our response to be perfect." As Lauren stood in that parking lot, making call after call, orchestrating what was about to become the most spectacular example of corporate justice in recent memory, her hands continued to shake with that controlled fury. This wasn't fear. This wasn't nervousness. This was the righteous anger of someone who had spent her entire life fighting discrimination, only to face it at her own property. But while Lauren was out in the parking lot preparing to rain down corporate thunder, inside the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, the staff was having their own little celebration. And what they were saying made your blood boil all over again. Sarah Mitchell, the blonde receptionist who had started this entire nightmare with her "you people" comment, was practically glowing with satisfaction. She was leaning against the front desk, chatting with Amy Chen like they had just accomplished something worthy of praise. "Good riddance," Sarah said with a smug smile that you wanted to slap right off her face. These people always think they're entitled to everything. Even with Lauren gone, even when she thought no one was listening, Sarah couldn't help but reveal the depth of her racism. She was genuinely pleased that she had denied service to a black woman, proud of her role in what she saw as keeping undesirable people out of their hotel. Amy Chen, not to be outdone in the cruelty department, added her own observation. Did you see her cheap suitcase? Probably from Walmart. The pettiness was breathtaking. Amy was critiquing Lauren's luggage now, as if the brand of someone's suitcase determined their worth as a human being. But this comment revealed something deeper. The assumption that black people couldn't afford quality items, that their very presence in upscale spaces must be some kind of mistake or deception. Jessica Torres, the night manager who had told Lauren she didn't belong in this kind of neighborhood, joined the conversation with her own racist commentary. At least she's gone, Jessica said with obvious relief. We can get back to serving real customers. Real customers. Even after what they had just done, Jessica still didn't see anything wrong with denying service to a black woman. In her mind, they had successfully protected their hotel from someone who didn't deserve to be there. Marcus Johnson, the security guard who had been ready to physically remove Lauren, added his own regret to the conversation. Should have let me throw her out from the start. The casual violence in that statement was chilling. Marcus was actually disappointed that he hadn't gotten to use physical force against a woman whose only crime had been requesting a hotel room while being black. But while his employees were congratulating themselves on their racism, Robert Richardson was starting to feel the first stirrings of unease. Something about Lauren's mention of contacting the branch manager was nagging at him. There had been something in her voice, something in her confidence that didn't quite add up. Richardson retreated to his office and picked up his phone, dialing his superior with the kind of nervousness that suggested he was starting to realize he might have made a mistake. "Sir?" Richardson said when the call connected. "We had an incident tonight. Some woman claimed she was calling a board meeting." Richardson tried to frame the situation as a minor disturbance, a delusional customer making empty threats. But even as he spoke, there was uncertainty in his voice, because deep down, Richardson knew that confident people didn't usually make specific claims about board meetings unless they had some reason to believe those claims would be taken seriously. She seemed educated, Richardson admitted reluctantly, and she knew corporate terminology. But obviously, she was just trying to intimidate us. What Richardson didn't know was that his phone call was about to be interrupted by events that would make his blood run cold. While Richardson was on the phone with his superior, trying to minimize what had just happened, the first black SUV pulled up outside the Grand Metropolitan Hotel. Then a second, then a third. These weren't just any vehicles. They were the kind of luxury transportation used by corporate executives, complete with tinted windows and professional drivers. Richardson happened to glance out his office window and saw these vehicles arriving. His voice trailed off mid-sentence as he watched well-dressed men and women stepping out of the SUVs, moving with the purposeful stride of people who were there on serious business. "Sir?" Richardson interrupted his own explanation. "There are people arriving. Expensive cars. They look like board members, like executives, like exactly the kind of people Lauren had said she was calling." Richardson's superior on the other end of the phone was asking questions, but Richardson couldn't focus on answering them. Because walking through the lobby doors were some of the most powerful people in the hospitality industry, and they all looked furious. The Grand Metropolitan's lobby, which had been peaceful and quiet just an hour earlier, suddenly filled with the energy of corporate crisis management. These weren't tourists or business travelers. These were people who made million-dollar decisions and ran companies that employed thousands of people. And leading this group was William Hayes, the branch manager whose name Lauren had specifically mentioned. Hayes was a man who had built his career on operational excellence and customer service. He was someone who believed that hospitality wasn't just about luxury accommodations. It was about treating every guest with dignity and respect. Hayes walked into that lobby like a man on a mission, and his expression would have made you shrink back if you had been responsible for what happened there that night. This was not a man who was going to tolerate explanations or excuses. This was a man who was there to clean the house. Richardson rushed out of his office, still holding his phone, panic written all over his face. "What's happening?" Richardson asked, his voice cracking with the kind of fear that came from suddenly realizing you might be in serious trouble. "Who are all these people?" Hayes didn't even look at Richardson initially. He was scanning the lobby, taking in the scene, making mental notes about everything he observed. When he finally turned his attention to Richardson, his expression was cold enough to freeze water. "Robert?" Hayes said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from someone who had never had to raise their voice to be taken seriously. "What the hell happened here tonight?" Richardson, desperately trying to regain control of the situation, fell back on the same dismissive attitude he had shown Lauren. "Sir, we just removed a disruptive person," Richardson said, puffing up with false confidence. "Standard procedure. Nothing to worry about." Disruptive person. Richardson was still framing Lauren as the problem, still operating under the assumption that he could spin this situation in his favor. He had no idea that he was about to come face to face with the woman he had just humiliated, and that she was about to reveal exactly who she was. The lobby doors opened again, and Lauren Matthews walked in, flanked by more board members. She moved with the confidence of someone who knew she was about to deliver justice, someone who had been looking forward to this moment for the past hour. Richardson barely glanced in her direction, still focused on explaining himself to Hayes. And then, he made the mistake that would define the rest of this confrontation. "Security!" Richardson shouted, pointing at Lauren. "This woman is trespassing." Even then, even with corporate executives filling his lobby, even with his boss standing right there asking hard questions, Richardson's first instinct was to have Lauren removed. He still saw her as a problem to be solved, rather than a person who deserved an explanation. Hayes turned to look at Lauren, and something passed between them. The recognition of two people who had worked together for years, who respected each other professionally and personally. Expression shifted from confusion to understanding to barely controlled rage. "Robert," Hayes said, his voice now carrying a dangerous edge, "I'd like you to meet Lauren Matthews." Richardson looked at Lauren with the same dismissive expression he had had all evening, clearly not recognizing the significance of the introduction. Hayes let the silence stretch for a moment, watching Richardson's face, waiting for understanding to dawn. When it didn't, he delivered the words that destroyed Richardson's world. "CEO and majority owner of Sterling Matthews Hospitality Group," Hayes continued, his voice cutting through the lobby like a blade. "Everyone's boss." The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that marble lobby as the full weight of what Hayes had just said sank in. Richardson's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally, absolute terror. Sarah Mitchell, who had been watching this exchange from the front desk, suddenly understood why Lauren had been so confident about that phone call. Amy Chen's hand flew to her mouth as she realized what they had done. Jessica Torres took a step backward, as if distance might somehow protect her from what was coming. Marcus Johnson, the security guard who had been ready to physically remove Lauren, suddenly looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Lauren Matthews, the woman they had told to try the homeless shelter, the woman they had accused of theft, the woman they had said didn't belong in their neighborhood, the woman they had threatened to have physically removed. She owned the entire hotel chain. She signed their paychecks. She had the power to end all of their careers with a single word. And judging by the expression on her face, that was exactly what she was planning to do. The reckoning had arrived, and it was going to be more satisfying than anything you had ever witnessed. These people were about to learn that actions had consequences, that racism cost careers, and that sometimes the universe delivered perfect justice. Richardson's face drained of all color as reality crashed over him like a tidal wave. The blood literally left his cheeks as his brain processed what Hayes had just said. The man who had just told Lauren she belonged at a homeless shelter, who had suggested she take the bus, who had said their rooms cost more than she made in a month. This man was staring at his own boss. Not just any boss, but the woman who signed his paychecks, who owned the very marble floors he was standing on, who had the power to end his career with a single word. Sarah Mitchell's transformation was even more dramatic. That smug expression she had been wearing all evening, the one that had said she was superior to Lauren, the one that had said she had all the power in this situation, it crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. Her perfectly made-up face contorted with the realization that she had just committed career suicide in the most public way possible. Jessica Torres suddenly understood that her career hadn't just hit a speed bump. It had just driven off a cliff at full speed. The night manager, who had been so confident in her authority, who had rolled her eyes at Lauren's requests, who had told her she didn't belong in this kind of neighborhood. She was now realizing that she had just discriminated against the most powerful person in the building. Amy Chen started crying immediately, not the gentle tears of someone who was touched by emotion, but the ugly sobbing of someone who knew they had destroyed their own life. The young woman who had whispered about Lauren's cheap suitcase and stolen money was now facing the consequences of her racism in the most devastating way possible. Marcus Johnson, the imposing security guard who had been ready to physically remove Lauren, who had cracked his knuckles menacingly, who had asked if he could escort her out. This man suddenly looked small and pathetic. His broad shoulders seemed to shrink as he stepped backward, as if he could somehow escape the reckoning that was about to unfold. Lauren Matthews stood in the center of this chaos with the composure of someone who had been waiting her entire life for this moment. This was the culmination of every slight she had endured, every door that had been closed in her face, every time someone had assumed she didn't belong somewhere. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had built an empire from nothing and wasn't about to let anyone tear it down. "Good evening," Lauren said, her voice cutting through the terrified silence like a perfectly sharpened blade. Each word was measured, controlled, carrying the weight of corporate authority and personal dignity. 2 hours ago, I attempted to book a room at this property. The silence that followed was deafening. You could practically hear hearts pounding and careers ending in real time. The crystal chandeliers seemed to dim as the weight of the moment settled over the marble lobby. Even the classical music playing overhead seemed inappropriate for the reckoning that was about to unfold. "I was told this hotel doesn't serve my kind," Lauren continued, letting each word hang in the air like an accusation that couldn't be taken back. "Miss Mitchell, would you like to repeat what you said to me?" Sarah's response was pathetic in its desperation. She stammered like a broken machine. "Miss Matthews, I didn't know. If I had known who you were." And here's where Lauren delivered the knockout punch that left you cheering and possibly throwing things at your screen in satisfaction. "So your racism was conditional?" Lauren asked, her voice sharp with controlled fury that had been building for 2 hours. "You only discriminated against black people who weren't rich? Your prejudice had a salary threshold?" The question exposed the ugly truth that Sarah didn't even realize she was revealing. That her apology wasn't about recognizing the fundamental wrongness of discrimination, but about getting caught discriminating against someone with power. It wasn't real remorse, it was damage control. Sarah wasn't sorry she was racist, she was sorry she had gotten caught being racist to the wrong person. Richardson, desperately trying to salvage his 15-year career, attempted what had to be the worst damage control in corporate history. "Miss Matthews, there's been a terrible misunderstanding." Lauren cut him off with surgical precision. "The only misunderstanding was how you all still had jobs." The finality in her voice should have terrified anyone who had ever treated another human being as less than equal. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a discussion. This was a reckoning. She turned to Jessica Torres with the focus of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury, methodically building her case against each person who had participated in her humiliation. "Jessica, you called me trouble. You said I was here to case the place. You told me I didn't belong in this neighborhood. Explain that." Jessica's voice cracked under the pressure. I didn't mean." "You meant exactly what you said," Lauren responded, refusing to let anyone minimize their actions or hide behind weak excuses. "You looked at a black woman asking for a hotel room and assumed she was a criminal. That wasn't a misunderstanding, that was racism." She turned to Amy Chen next, the young woman who had thought Lauren's suitcase was cheap and her money was probably stolen. "Amy, what was that about stolen money? What exactly made you think my credit card was fraudulent?" Amy was sobbing then. The kind of desperate crying that came from knowing you had destroyed your own future. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean it." "You didn't mean what exactly?" Lauren pressed. "You didn't mean to assume that a black woman couldn't legitimately afford to stay here? You didn't mean to suggest I was a criminal based on nothing but the color of my skin? Do you think the employees deserved forgiveness? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. Like and share if you're enjoying this story." But Lauren wasn't interested in apologies that came only after getting caught. She wasn't there to make these people feel better about their racism. She addressed Hayes and the board with the clinical precision of a CEO presenting a crisis management report to shareholders. "Every single employee participated in blatant racial discrimination," she stated, her voice carrying across the lobby with perfect clarity. "This wasn't one person having a bad day. This wasn't a communication breakdown. This was institutional racism in action, from the front desk to the general manager's office." She paused, letting the board members absorb the full scope of what had happened. "They told me I belonged in a homeless shelter. They accused me of theft. They said I didn't belong in this neighborhood. They threatened me with physical removal, and when I maintained my dignity and asked for basic customer service, they escalated their attacks." Hayes was taking notes, his expression growing darker with each detail. "Mr. Richardson," Lauren continued, "told me our rooms cost more than I made in a month. He directed me to the bus station. When I persisted in requesting service, he ordered security to remove me for disturbing the atmosphere. And then came the moment you had been waiting for. Justice, swift and absolute, delivered with the precision of someone who had built a career on making difficult decisions. Mr. Richardson, your employment is terminated immediately." The words hit Richardson like a physical blow. His face went white, then red, then white again as the reality sank in. 15 years of employment, gone in a single sentence. Richardson's desperation erupted in the kind of threat that revealed his true character. "You can't do this. I'll sue for wrongful termination. I have rights." Lauren's response was ice cold and devastating. "Please do. I have security footage of everything that happened tonight. I have witnesses from the board. I have documented evidence of federal civil rights violations. I would welcome the opportunity to present your behavior in a court of law." She paused, letting that sink in. "But let me save you some legal fees, Mr. Richardson. Racial discrimination was not a protected activity. You couldn't sue for being fired for breaking the law." One by one, like dominoes falling in perfect sequence, Sarah, Jessica, Amy, and Marcus were fired on the spot. Years of employment, benefits, career advancement, professional relationships, all of it destroyed in minutes by their own racist actions. "Miss Mitchell," Lauren said to the sobbing former receptionist, "your comment about you people was recorded on security cameras. Your suggestion that I try the homeless shelter was documented. Good luck explaining that to future employers when they do background checks. Sarah's crying intensified as she realized that this moment was going to follow her for the rest of her career. Jessica, your comment about me casing the place suggested you believed black customers were inherently criminal. That went in your employment file, which would be made available to any future employers who requested references. Jessica Torres, who had been so confident in her authority just hours earlier, now looked like she was going to be sick. Amy, your assumption about stolen money and cheap luggage revealed a level of prejudice that made you unsuitable for any customer-facing role in the hospitality industry. And Marcus, Lauren turned to the former security guard. Your eagerness to use physical intimidation against a customer requesting basic service showed exactly why you should never be trusted with any position of authority. Hayes spoke up, his voice heavy with the weight of corporate responsibility. Lauren, I had no idea this was happening at our properties. This was completely unacceptable. That was exactly the problem, William, Lauren responded, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had spent her career fighting institutional racism. This culture existed because we hadn't been vigilant enough. We had created environments where people felt comfortable expressing their prejudices because they'd think there would be consequences. But Lauren didn't just destroy, she rebuilt. And what she built next was going to restore your faith in corporate leadership and human decency. Within days, she brought in completely new leadership, each person carefully chosen not just for their qualifications but for their commitment to inclusive hospitality. Maria Rodriguez became general manager, an experienced leader who had spent her career focused on diversity and inclusion. Someone who understood that luxury hospitality meant making every guest feel valued and welcome. James Washington took over the front desk. He was a former civil rights advocate who had transitioned into hospitality because he believed that travel and accommodation should be accessible to everyone, regardless of their background. Patricia Kim became the new night manager, a hospitality expert with specialized training in cultural competence and inclusive service. When Lauren finally approached the front desk to book her room, the same request that had started this entire nightmare, Maria's response was everything the original staff's hadn't been. "It would be our honor, Miss Matthews," Maria said with genuine warmth. "Welcome to the Grand Metropolitan. How can we make your stay exceptional?" The contrast was stunning. This was what hospitality was supposed to look like: professional, welcoming, focused on service rather than judgment. Lauren's transformation of the hotel went beyond just changing personnel. She implemented comprehensive bias training for all staff, not just at the Grand Metropolitan but across her entire hotel chain. She established partnerships with civil rights organizations to ensure that her properties were truly welcoming to all guests. She created reporting mechanisms that allowed guests to document discrimination and ensured that complaints were taken seriously. Racism in business wasn't just morally wrong, Lauren explained to a gathering of hospitality industry leaders 6 months later. It was economically stupid. When you excluded customers based on prejudice, you were literally turning away money. You were damaging your brand. You were creating liability. And most importantly, you were perpetuating a cycle of hate that hurt everyone. The changes Lauren implemented rippled outward through the industry. Other hotel chains began examining their own practices, implementing similar training programs, creating more inclusive environments. What had started as one woman being denied a hotel room became a catalyst for industry-wide change. 6 months later, the Grand Metropolitan wasn't just a luxury hotel. It was a model for inclusive hospitality. The staff, led by Maria, James, and Patricia, treated every guest with the kind of respect and dignity that should have been standard in the industry. Guests of all backgrounds felt welcome, valued, and appreciated. Lauren's final reflection captured the essence of true leadership. The most powerful response to hate wasn't more hate. It was building something better. When someone showed you their ugly character, you didn't have to respond with ugliness. You could choose to respond with grace, with justice, and with determination to create change. She paused, looking out at the bustling lobby of the transformed Grand Metropolitan. Sometimes you had to tear down the old to build something new. But when you rebuilt, you had the opportunity to create something that reflected your values, not your anger. Richardson and his staff showed me their character that night. Then I showed them mine. This was what justice looked like when it was served with perfect precision and long-term vision. If this story inspired you, if it made you believe that sometimes good people won and bad actions had consequences, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needed to see that racism had real consequences in the real world. Because Lauren Matthews had just proved that sometimes the universe didn't just deliver what people deserved. It delivered it with compound interest. If you enjoyed this story, hit the subscribe button, like and share with others so they can learn too.